Veridical perception and errors of judgment. In Meditations 4, of truth and falsity, Descartes considers the conditions under which it is possible to make errors in knowledge and offers general epistemic advice about how to avoid them. If God exists and is no deceiver, and stands behind all our clear and distinct perceptions to guarantee their epistemic certainty as truthful representations of an external world, then how is it possible for any of us to be mistaken? Descartes explains that God's perfection precludes the possibility of willful deception. We read, I recognize that it cannot happen that he should ever deceive me. For if all deceit and trickery, some element of imperfection is to be found. And although to be able to deceive seems to be some indication of intelligence or power, nonetheless, to wish to deceive is beyond doubt a proof of malice or feeble-mindedness to which God cannot be liable. Descartes remarks that in addition to cognition, thinkers such as ourselves are also provided by God with the faculty of judgment. Infallible perception by itself is not enough and cannot lead to epistemically certain knowledge unless it is accompanied by correct judgment. Judgment is essential to knowledge, and yet it is also the potential source of error insofar as it is exercised by individual free will. As in the moral sphere, free epistemic judgment always has the possibility of getting things right or going astray by leading us into error, depending on whether we use it properly or improperly. How we exercise epistemic judgment is up to us, something we can learn to control. If all perceptual mistakes are due to the will rather than our epistemically certain, clear, and distinct perceptions, then we should, in principle, be able to avoid all errors of knowledge by controlling the will and directing it in accord with the correct method. It is no different than fallibility, trying to conduct our lives according to moral precepts and willful moral judgment. Our perceptual, like our moral mistakes, are always our own fault. Willfully misapplying judgment in evaluating the information contained in epistemically certain, clear, and distinct perceptions to draw conclusions that do not accord with the truth or are unsupported by the evidence. God's perfection guarantees the epistemically certainty of our perceptions considered in themselves. What we judge about them can but need not lead us into error, rather than towards greater epistemically certain knowledge, for the sake of which we must properly discipline our willful epistemic judgment. In general, if we want to avoid errors, we must not jump to conclusions when judging the epistemically certain data of perception. This is a category of advice that can be finely subdivided in many ways for many kinds of different cases. Descartes further explains, Besides, he says, I know by experience that there is within me a faculty of judging, which I certainly receive from God, along with everything else that is in me. And since he does not wish to deceive me, this God-given faculty must be such that I shall never go astray as long as I use it correctly. Of course, we do make mistakes, as Descartes freely admits in his own case. The argument that God exists and is no deceiver, and that God is the perfect author of our epistemic abilities, should imply that in some sense we are incapable of error. There must be, therefore, some other source of our mistakes, which Descartes, as we have explained, attributes to the willful faculty of judgment. He explains. Finally, coming closer to myself and investigating the nature of my errors, I realize that they depend on two simultaneously operative causes, namely the faculty I possess of acquiring knowledge and the faculty of choosing or free will. That is, they depend on the intellect and the will simultaneously. For though through the intellect alone, I only perceive ideas on which I can pass judgment, nor can any error in the strict sense be found in it when considered from this precise viewpoint. For although perhaps there are innumerable things in existence of which the ideas are not in me, I cannot be said, strictly speaking, to be deprived of these ideas, but only in a negative sense, to be without them. Since, certainly, I can adduce no reason to prove that God should have given me a greater faculty of acquiring knowledge than the one he has given me. And although I understand him to be the most skillful craftsman possible, I do not therefore think that he should have endowed each individual piece of his handiwork with all the perfections with which he may endow some. What then is the remedy for the excesses of willful judgment that leads us from God-given and guaranteed, demon-proof, infallible, and epistemically certain, clear and distinct perceptions to mistaken judgments? Can we avoid making judgment errors of perceptual knowledge? Descartes believes that we can avoid mistakes by restraining judgment and never going beyond the contents of clear and distinct perceptions in a bid for knowledge. Thus, he would say, now, if indeed, whenever I do not sufficiently clear and distinctly perceive where the truth lies, I refrain from passing judgment. It is clear that I am acting rightly and not being deceived. But if I either affirm or deny, then I'm not making the right use of my freedom of choice. And if I adopt the view that is false, I shall be altogether deceived. Yet if I adopt the other view, although it happens to be the true one, I shall still be at fault, because it is manifest by the natural light that a decision on the part of the will should always be preceded by a perception on the part of the intellect. The privation in which the essence of error consists lies in this wrong use of free choice. The privation, that is, lies in the operation itself, in so far as it derives from me, but not in the faculty given to me by God, or in the operation, in so far as it depends on him. We avoid errors of judgment by confining it to the limits of clear and distinct perceptions. This does not mean that we can never infer that the world actually is as it appears to be in perception, but only that we are not to make such judgments when our perceptions are anything less than clear and distinct. Descartes maintains that we can correctly judge the existence and condition of things in the world provided we limit ourselves to the information contained in clear and distinct perceptions. The difficulty is to be able to tell the difference between when we are and when we are not experiencing clear and distinct perceptions. This would appear to be a matter of degree. Some perceptions will be more or less clear and distinct than others, so that it may be hard to draw a sharp line between those that are and those that are not clear and distinct in the way that Descartes requires. If we wish to apply Descartes' epistemic principles effectively and with good result, therefore, we must be able to correctly judge when a perception is clear and distinct in the highest epistemically knowledge-conferring degree, and when it is not. Since this is itself a matter of judgment, there might be insuperable difficulties in trying to contain willful judgment within the inexact limits. Descartes requires, in order to know with epistemic certainty, that we arrive not at false beliefs mistaken for knowledge. Descartes' proposal for gathering empirical knowledge now begins to show its weaknesses. We must exercise judgment concerning whether and which of our perceptions are clear and distinct, in order to know when and to what extent we are epistemically entitled to correctly judge the conditions of the external world. If we make the right choices, we arrive at knowledge. And if we make the wrong choices, we fall into error. We must restrain the will to keep from jumping to conclusions that are not adequately supported by epistemically certain perceptions. The problem, once again, is to know when we have and when we have not properly restrained the will to judge, so as to avoid error, at the same time that we do not fail to judge a given perception to be true. Nor is the will in these matters easily restrained. Otherwise, there would not be so much error in the history of knowledge. In judging the nature of the world, it is possible to deceive ourselves, if not to deceive, to be deceived by the epistemic pranks of an evil demon into misjudging that a particular perception is clear and distinct, or that it possesses the requisite degree of clarity and distinctness in order to allow the will to judge that the perception warrants the judgment that the state of the world is actually as it is perceived. If Descartes escapes the Cartesian circle, there are other difficulties that comes out in his theory or understanding of knowledge and metaphysics. To begin with, the proof for the existence of a veracious God, it should be noted that it is not enough for Descartes to prove that God exists and is no deceiver. God must also be shown to be Descartes' creator, causally responsible for his sense modalities and cognitive abilities as an essentially thinking thing. This part of the argument is vulnerable to the objections raised against mind-body dualism, as well as the complicated proof that Descartes' clear and distinct ideas of God can have no other cause than God. Descartes claims that the idea of God cannot be synthesized by the mind out of separately acquired clear and distinct ideas of power, knowledge, goodness, and infinity, because a clear and distinct idea of God is the idea of an essentially unified being. The objection is supposed to preclude the possibility of the mind's fabricating concept of God by piecing together God's properties from several sources and then imagining them to obtain in one being to infinite degrees of perfection. If the mind has the idea of essential unity derived from some non-divine source, however, then God's essential unity might be thrown into the imagination's crucible as well, in order subconsciously to manufacture a clear and distinct idea of God as an essentially unified being of infinite perfection. Suppressed, if we suppress, for example, the understanding that if we suppress the reconstruction of Descartes' main argument, the assumption states that if Descartes' sense modalities and cognitive abilities are created by a veracious God, then they cannot also be partially constituted or interfered with in any way by the evil demon. Descartes assumes that the demon can only threaten the truthfulness of clear and distinct ideas if the demon, rather than God, controls a thinker's cognition. A stronger rational basis for doubt, which Descartes does not consider, is a scenario in which God constitutes the thinker in such a way that the demon can freely interfere with the thinker's cognition so as to produce perfectly clear and distinct ideas that radically misrepresent reality. Perhaps God allows the demon to intervene in our perceptions despite having first constituted his thinking creatures with truth discerning, clear and distinct ideas, in the way that God is said to permit Satan to tempt our once perfectly made souls with false promises as a trial of faith. Perhaps God constitutes Descartes as an essentially thinking thing, but restricts Descartes' reality representing clear and distinct ideas to the empty truths of logic, excluding even whatever else is revealed by the light of nature. It would then be accidental to Descartes' essential thinking nature whether or not his clear and distinct ideas truthfully represent reality. God, for reasons unfathomable to finite minds, might for all we know relinquish responsibility for the truth or falsehood of clear and distinct ideas relating to the reality of the external world and allow the principles of natural philosophy to be systemically misrepresented by the evil demon. God might conceivably do so in order to cause humankind to turn away from the worthless things of the empirical world to spiritual values. Or perhaps God's epistemic righteousness, like God's perfect moral justice, is not meted out in this world, but only in the afterlife. Then it would be true that God's veracity guarantees the truthfulness of Descartes' ideas, but not of any thoughts he has during his embodied sojourn in his life on earth. How are we to restrain the will to avoid mistakes in judgment from epistemically clear and distinct perceptions? To do so, we must first need to know when we were and when we were not clearly and distinctly perceiving the world. Is this so obvious? Am I clearly and distinctly perceiving the world right now as I look about the room in which I am writing or talking? Perhaps so. But what can I judge of it if I'm not to go beyond the limits of clear and distinct perceptions themselves? Can I conclude that there actually exists a room with the color and shapes and other perceived properties of things? Are these judgments about the external world epistemically certain, such that no belief could possibly be more strongly justified than my belief that 2 plus 2 is equivalent to 4? It is hard to see how we have made any progress at all in this regard. Even if we agree that Descartes proves with epistemic certainty that God exists and is no deceiver, God's perfect goodness requires God to thwart the evil demon's mischief. But how, where, and when does God do so? And can I know that He is doing so right now as I look at what I take to be the real physical entities around me? In all these scenarios, the evil demon deprives Descartes of certitude, even on the assumption that Descartes is an essentially thinking thing created by a veracious God. God, in Descartes' conception, is powerful enough to contain the evil demon. And to Descartes, it may appear that God's infinite goodness requires him to prevent the demon's mischief. But God's ways are inscrutable. And God's humanly incomprehensible intentions and unlimited free will lend a further rational basis for skepticism about the truthfulness of clear and distinct ideas. Despite the non-circular proof that God exists, is no deceiver, and has creative and sustaining responsibility for all our perceptual cognitive abilities. Finally, what does Descartes mean by truthful representation? The idea presumably involves a positive correspondence between world and idea. What is the possible application of the concept? However, if we are never in a position to see around the corners of appearances, to judge them as representative or misrepresentative, Descartes' argument might avoid circularity by appealing to the light of nature as an epistemically certain foundation for the proof that God exists and is no deceiver. How does he know prior to this point in the argument that the demon has not mischievously provided him with a faulty light of nature or a faulty sense of non-contradiction, or that although God has perfectly constituted these faculties, the demon interferes with their normal operations? If this is conceivable at all, and it is hard to deny that it might be, then all of Descartes' conclusions are thereby subject to the same maximum degree of skepticism that is supposed to prevail in his argument only prior to proving that God exists and is no deceiver. To conclude, all these commentaries on Descartes' meditations. The desire to make knowledge epistemically certain is a long-standing ambition in philosophy. Descartes offers a model of certainty that begins by projecting the most powerful imaginable basis for doubt, and then explains how to overcome the methodological skepticism that results. He proposes to show that even under the strongest reason for doubting, whatever it is possible to doubt, one still cannot doubt one's own existence. From this immovable Archimedean point, Descartes attempts to ground all of knowledge on absolutely secure foundations. Taking mathematical certainty, scientific certainty as his standard, he tries to raise the epistemic status of all perceptual knowledge to the level of mathematics. He argues that God must exist in order to explain the content of his idea of God on the principle revealed by the light of nature, that the cause of any idea must have at least as much formal reality as the idea has objective reality. If the idea of God were to lack an adequate explanation, then we would be violating the necessary principle, general principle even, that you cannot make something from nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. The idea of God as a spirit with all perfections is understood by Descartes as implying that God is no deceiver. As Descartes' perfect creator, God provides him with infallible cognition. It follows, if Descartes is right, that all his clear and distinct perceptions have the same high degree of epistemic certainty as mathematics. Descartes explains the possibility of error as a matter of judgment rather than perception. Clear and distinct perception, considered in and of itself, is infallible, provided that God exists and is no deceiver. We get into trouble epistemically only when we fail to restrain willful judgment in jumping to conclusions that go beyond the evidence of the senses. Descartes accordingly offers practical advice for avoiding error by overreaching what can be known with epistemic certainty in perception. The problem of the Cartesian circle suggests a logical difficulty in Descartes' epistemology. The problem is that he seems to need to assume that God exists in order to uphold the proposition that his clear and distinct ideas are certain, which he needs in turn to prove that God exists. The problem might be solved by emphasizing his reliance throughout the meditations on the light of nature as a faculty of reason that does not need to be validated by any external justification and is needed even to decide upon the strongest basis for systemic doubt. Descartes' legacy in metaphysics and in epistemology or theory of knowledge makes him one of the most important thinkers, even among those contemporary critics who accept few, if any, of Descartes' conclusions. For those who are taking this class in the Canvas shell or in the learning management system, please answer the question: how is Descartes' concept of the role of the will in making perceptual judgment errors supposed to cohere with the proposition that our divinely created cognitive faculties are infallible? Please replay just in case you didn't get it. But if you did, please answer in the space provided below. Again, thank you very much for listening. This is Samo't sa Simula. Please, if you like this content, click like, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for listening.